Hello, my name is Ellis Garey, and I'm a fourth-year doctoral student at New York University in the Joint History and Middle Eastern Studies program. I'm excited to be joining ANAMED remotely this fall, and I hope to be able to join in person this spring. So to speak a bit about my dissertation is tentatively titled Becoming Workers, Labor Activism, and Mass Politics in Greater Syria between 1880 and 1936. As the title indicates, I hope to focus on the emergence of the worker as a key participant in the new forms of social contestation and mass politics which emerged in Greater Syria during the late Ottoman and early post-Ottoman periods. Scholars have noted in passing that following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, social movements, including anti-colonial and women's movements, made a variety of demands on the newly installed French mandate. These brief accounts have largely ignored the role of workers in these movements and have presumed that labor activism and other modes of mass politics are essentially post-World War I phenomena. Yet there is good evidence and research that suggests that as early as the 1880s, working people in Greater Syria drew upon a new language of class as they began to engage in a form of mass politics which included work stoppages, petitions to the government, newspaper debates, and public protest. In my research, I ask, how did people come to identify as workers and decide to engage in collective action on that basis? How did the development of working class identity and workers' collective action relate to other contemporary social movements? And what was the impact of these movements, in which workers played an active role, on the course of capitalist development and state formation at a time in which the national boundaries of political control of Greater Syria were in flux? So to give a brief overview of the context of my dissertation, in the long 19th century, people throughout Greater Syria experienced dramatic shifts in how they organized their daily lives. Beginning in the 1840s, the Ottoman ruling class undertook centralization efforts across the empire in order to more efficiently control people and resources, including the enlargement of ports and the construction of telegraph networks and railroads. Ottoman infrastructure development was carried out by the state in some cases and sold in the form of concessions to Ottoman or foreign subjects in others. These projects employed substantial numbers of wage workers, many of whom migrated from other parts of the empire in search of work. Existing research, including the wonderful work of Ilham Khouri Makdisi, indicates that this also helped foster the spread of new visions of social identity, forms of collective action, and protest. In the same time period that I'm looking at, local and foreign capitalists invested in the production of silk, tobacco, and cotton throughout the region. While many of these goods had been integral to the economy of the region for centuries, the production sites and practices changed in this period. In Greater Syria and in Mount Lebanon in particular, it wasn't until the 19th century that local and French capitalists began to open spinning factories in the region, as opposed to the existing model of home production for silk. So in this context, I plan to look at how people came to identify with that category worker. It's clear that from the 1880s onwards, strikes arose as a new form of social contestation. Beirut was among the port cities in which strikes became an important tactic by the final quarter of the 19th century. These strikes often took place at the very sites of Ottoman imperial centralization and capitalist development: ports, railroads, and factories. There, workers demanded increased wages and decreased working hours from their private and state employers, but also aimed complaints directly at the Ottoman state, which they employed to discipline or even expel the foreign capitalists, employing and exploiting them. By the time that an unprecedented wave of strikes broke out across the empire following the Constitutional Revolution of 1908, workers were engaging in an established practice of protest. I hope that my research will help establish how workers participated in post-1908 mobilizations and to what extent they altered the language and ideological terms of their demands following the Constitutional Revolution. So when we look at workers' collective action between the period of 1880 and 1936, we can also begin to reframe the social and political transformations which took place. I hope to contribute to the work that folks have been doing on this topic by asking specifically how workers and social movements interacted with various governing authorities, Ottoman imperial and local authorities, as well as French Mandate authorities later on, and how they shaped nation-state formation. In the last 30 years of the Ottoman Empire's existence, the Ottoman government responded in a variety of ways to the strikes, at times supporting workers and in other moments outlining the practice of striking. I hope to get at the reasons behind the changing Ottoman position towards workers through a close examination of Ottoman archives, including reports from local government officials, correspondence with local capitalists, and petitions from workers. So following World War I, workers continued to utilize the strike to make concrete demands on the ruling power, which was then the French Mandate Authority, related to working hours and pay. My preliminary research and the research of others into French Mandate legislation indicates that labor law in the Mandate period was influenced both by local workers' demands and by domestic political conditions in France. Following large strike waves in 1920s, French Mandate authorities imprisoned workers and Communist Party activists in Lebanon. So, while the transition from the Ottoman to French rule presented social movements and workers who took part in them with a new set of conditions, the shifts in social organization, which began long before the war, spanned the political divide. So too did the movements and groups that arose in response to these social changes. So this included the fact that many of the founders of the Communist Party in Lebanon and Syria had been active workers and worker activists in the Ottoman period. So I will finally look at the development of working class identity and workers' collective action related to contemporary social movements, including the formation of that Communist Party I just spoke of, the growth of movements calling for an end to colonialism in the region, and women's movements. In order to complete my dissertation research, I will rely upon newspaper, government, and personal documents housed in Lebanon, Turkey, and France. Thanks very much for taking the time to hear about my research today. I'm looking forward to beginning much of it and to meeting many of you who might work on related topics and to working with you and to being part of the ANAMED community.